Hi everybody. Welcome to our channel, The Scary Tales. Our scary and horror stories are designed to send chills down your spine. Enjoy the spine-tingling stories thrill. Here's your horror stories about urban legends. 1. The Smiling Man. A man was walking home late at night through a deserted city street when he noticed someone ahead of him. The figure was tall, thin, and dressed in a suit. He wasn't walking, he was dancing, gliding in an unnatural way under the street lights. As the man got closer, he saw the dancer's face. It was twisted into an impossibly wide, eerie grin, eyes locked onto him. The man's heart pounded as he tried to cross the street, but the smiling man mirrored his movements. Suddenly, the grinning figure broke into a sprint, running straight for him without making a sound. Terrified, the man turned and ran, sprinting through dark alleys until he reached his apartment and locked the door behind him. When he finally looked outside, the street was empty. But something told him the smiling man was still out there, looking for his next victim. 2. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. A young man was driving home late at night when he saw a girl standing on the roadside, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress. She looked lost and cold, so he stopped and offered her a ride. She nodded silently and got in the car. As they drove, she whispered directions to a house on the outskirts of town. When they arrived, he turned to tell her they had reached her home, only to find the passenger seat empty. Shaken, he knocked on the house's door. An elderly woman answered, and when he described the girl, she went pale. "That's my daughter," she said with tears in her eyes. She died in a car accident at that intersection 20 years ago. 3. The Black-Eyed Children. A man was alone in his house late at night when he heard a knock at the door. Looking through the peephole, he saw two children, a boy and a girl, standing in the darkness. Their heads were lowered, their voices eerily monotone as they spoke. "We need to use your phone. Let us in." Something felt wrong. He hesitated. The children raised their heads, and he saw their eyes. Completely black, soulless voids. Fear gripped him. He slammed the door shut and locked it, but the knocking continued for hours. When he finally dared to look outside in the morning, the children were gone. But strange things started happening, shadowy figures in the corners of his vision, whispers in the night. And every now and then, a soft knock at the door. Would you open it? Which one creeped you out the most? 4. The Man in the Back Seat. A woman was driving home alone at night when she noticed a car behind her, flashing its headlights and honking aggressively. She started to panic, speeding up, but the car stayed close, continuously flashing its lights. Terrified, she pulled into her driveway and rushed inside, locking the door. The pursuing car screeched to a stop, and a man jumped out, shouting for her to call the police. Confused, she hesitated, until he screamed, "There's someone in your back seat." When the police arrived, they found a man crouched behind the driver's seat, holding a knife. He had been hiding there the entire time, waiting for the right moment to strike. The flashing lights. Every time the driver saw the killer raise his knife, he turned on his high beams to scare him into stopping. 5. The Staring Stranger. A university student stayed late at the library one night studying. By the time she left, the campus was empty, and the walk to her dorm was eerily silent. As she hurried through a quiet pathway, she noticed a man standing under a streetlight, staring directly at her. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood still, watching. Uneasy, she picked up her pace. But as she passed, she realized something horrifying. His head wasn't moving, but his eyes were following her. Terrified, she ran all the way back to her dorm. The next morning, she heard the news. A woman had been murdered on that very same pathway, around the time she saw the man. And when she checked her reflection in the mirror that day, she saw something strange, bruises on her arms, as if someone had grabbed her. But she never remembered being touched. 6. The Rake. A couple was camping deep in the woods when they woke up in the middle of the night to an eerie scratching sound outside their tent. Thinking it was an animal, they ignored it and went back to sleep. A few minutes later, the scratching became louder, closer. Then came a raspy, unnatural whisper. "I see you." Paralyzed with fear, they held their breath. The tent suddenly collapsed as something clawed its way inside. They barely escaped, running for their lives. When they reached safety, they described the creature, tall, thin, pale, with empty black eyes and razor-sharp fingers. A local hunter went pale when he heard their story. "You saw the rake," he muttered. "If it lets you live, it follows you. Waits until you're alone." That night, as they lay in bed, they heard it again. The scratching. It had followed them home. Which one gave you chills? 7. The Elevator Game. A young woman, curious about a strange internet ritual, decided to play the elevator game alone in her apartment building late at night. The rules were simple: enter an empty elevator, press a specific sequence of buttons, and if done correctly, a woman would enter on the 5th floor. She followed the instructions, and sure enough, when the elevator reached the 5th floor, a woman stepped in. But she wasn't normal. She had long, unkempt black hair, Her face was pale, and she never looked up. The woman stood still as the elevator continued moving. The game's rules warned do not speak to her. Do not look at her. But curiosity got the better of her. She glanced at the woman's reflection in the elevator's metal doors. The figure grinned. The next morning, the woman was found in the elevator, muttering nonsense, eyes wide with terror. She never spoke again. 8. The phone call from inside the house. A babysitter was watching 2 kids one night when the house phone rang. A deep, raspy voice whispered, "Check on the children." Thinking it was a prank, she hung up. But the calls kept coming. Each time, the voice got more insistent, "Check on the children." Terrified, she called the police. They traced the call, it was coming from inside the house. She rushed upstairs to grab the children, but as she entered their room, she saw something horrifying. The closet door was slightly open, and inside, a shadowy figure was standing there, breathing heavily. The police arrived just in time, but the men had already killed the children. He had been hiding in the house all night, watching them. 9. The Midnight Bus 375, the Chinese ghost bus legend. One late night in Beijing, a man caught the last bus home. There were only a few passengers, a quiet elderly couple and a silent bus driver. At the next stop, 3 men got on, dressed in ancient, traditional robes, their faces pale and hollow. The air grew ice cold. The elderly couple began whispering frantically. Suddenly, the old man grabbed the younger passenger's arm. "You need to get off with us now." Frightened and confused, the men obeyed. As soon as they stepped off, the bus doors shut, and it drove off into the darkness. The young man, shaking, asked, "Why did we get off?" The old woman looked at him grimly. Those men had no feet. They were floating. The next morning, the bus was found abandoned in a ditch, miles away. Inside were the driver and passengers, all dead, faces twisted in horror. Which one creeped you out the most? 10. The Licked Hand, or Humans Can Lick Too. A young girl was home alone one night, comforted only by her large, loyal dog that slept beside her bed. Before going to sleep, she reached down, and the dog licked her hand, as usual. In the middle of the night, she woke up to a dripping sound. She assumed it was the faucet and went back to sleep after feeling her dog lick her hand again for reassurance. The dripping continued. Frustrated, she got up to check the bathroom. What she found made her scream. Her dog was hanging from the shower head, blood dripping onto the tiles. And on the mirror, written in smeared red letters, "Humans Can Lick Too." 11. The 3 a.m. Challenge. A group of teenagers decided to try the infamous 3 a.m. challenge, daring each other to summon supernatural forces by chanting a name 3 times in front of a mirror. They turned off the lights and whispered, "Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary." Nothing happened. They laughed it off. But then, one of them noticed something wrong in the mirror. Their reflections were normal, except for one. His head was slightly tilted, his eyes too dark, his grin unnaturally wide. The boy turned away from the mirror, but his reflection didn't. It kept smiling. The lights flickered. The mirror shattered. The next morning, his parents found him in the bathroom. The mirror was broken, and he was gone. Only his reflection remained. 12. The Shadow in the Closet. A little boy kept telling his parents about the shadow man in his closet. His parents dismissed it as an overactive imagination, until one night. The mother kissed him goodnight, turned off the lights, and just as she was leaving the room, she heard her son whisper, "Mommy, he's behind you." Chills ran down her spine. She turned slowly, nothing was there. She laughed nervously. "It's just your imagination, sweetie." Then the closet door creaked open on its own. Inside, she saw something tall and thin, with glowing eyes, grinning in the darkness. The next morning, the boy was gone. The closet door, still open. The end.